All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Monday, February 16th, and how's the state of the world?
um, it's on the brink.
Do you think
Perilous.
sometimes do you think sometimes that maybe we're too doom and gloom, that we have a tendency to maybe to catastrophize, or are we
Um,
not over?
okay, well, maybe on some, perhaps, but the risks are very real. First of all, things have, it's not like we're talking about these disturbing trends. Things have really changed. There's war in Ukraine, a major war in Europe. I don't need to go through the list. Things are happening, um, and we do appear to be on the verge of a major war in Iran. I don't know. It just seems how can you catastrophize about that? There is a chance that we'll avoid it. There are people in power, even in our own government, that understand that that is, potentially or likely to be a catastrophe, and they will fight against it. And they might eventually get their way. They just might. Our president may just bow down to reality. But just in view of everything that we've seen and the momentum that we see unfolding before us, it doesn't look good. It really doesn't.
Then why aren't more people alarmed? Why is I think that's why sometimes I wonder maybe I am catastrophizing, because it seems like most people don't seem to be aware of the danger we're in.
Yeah, well, I think it's the media space that they inhabit. If mainstream media is fixated on Donald Trump, his personality, and domestic politics. It's basically the blue versus red. What's happened in Minnesota, for example, the Pam Bondi disaster. These kind of things, and not to say that these don't have, they are important to some extent, but that's really what most people are fixated on. That's what they're talking about, and these geopolitical events, they're filtered. Again, it's just like these are places that we don't know. We don't, by and large, we don't know anything about them. We don't have friends or any connections to them, and they are presented to us through a filter. And in the case of Iran, it's always a demonizing filter. So if you heard anything about Iran over the last couple of months, it's that they're very bad and doing bad things again and killing their own people in great numbers. And I think the latest number that I've heard is 80,000. It keeps on going up. And you're just thinking, oh, okay. And then you hear something about a fleet in the Middle East, but you say, oh, yeah, this is something, unfortunately, that we've gotten used to. Going back to the Iraq War under George W. Bush, we assembled actually a much larger fleet. I understand we had 6 aircraft carriers, and it looks like we're going to have 2 right now. And so it's just something, and in the end, that didn't end well, and it became unpopular, but it was peripheral to most people's experience. It was something, again, we visited a great deal of damage on this country of Iraq. But it was something where the average American didn't pay the consequences. Now, if we had to pay the bill, which would have been something like $40,000 for every American family, if I remember correctly, there would have been an outcry. But our government just printed money, as it always does, and we just didn't feel the consequences. And so it's just something, again, these things are pushed to the periphery. I mean, but of course, I think we're completely right on focusing on them, because the consequences, if anything, first of all, the consequences are huge for the people involved. And yeah, okay, it's natural to be concerned about your own people. But when, like in the case of Iraq, you have maybe 1 million people dead and 4 million refugees and whatever, that bothers me, and I think it should bother more of us. And in this case, though, is this something where if this war actually takes place, we will feel the consequences, and you're a fool not to be concerned about it. I think
Well,
another
maybe.
thing too is just the trend. It's just this should be very alarming. Alarm bells should be going off all over the place. It's just the conduct of our government. That has in some ways just become even more reckless and under Donald Trump, but is an extension of what happened before. this threats to take Greenland, the kidnapping and then the kidnapping of Maduro, the subjugation of Venezuela, the seizure of oil tankers, and now this, attack on no basis whatsoever, really, just that is being planned against Iran. This is not the behavior of a stable country. And, just like if nothing else, you should look at that and say that there's something seriously wrong here. The last time I think the world was presented with a threat like this was, to go back to my, our episode on Friday, was with Hitler, and Germany, this expansionist power, that was, seizing territory, making promises, breaking them, seizing more territory. Now, again, I know that's kind of an overwrought, everybody's Hitler or whatever, and obviously Donald Trump is not Hitler. But there is this very, very reckless behavior by our military, aggressive, and to an extent that I think people should find that very, very alarming.
Yeah, agreed. You talk about, the consequences are going to be severe for all of us, and we'd be a fool not to think about, what's happening. Can you explain to us a bit more what these consequences are? Like, what are the dangers? Because like you said, most Americans, they just don't give a damn about people in other countries and what's happening. But how would you sell to them? Like, even if you don't care, if you don't have a heart and don't care about what's happening to those people over there, why should you care? What's the danger coming? What are the consequences?
Yeah, well, I guess the most obvious is the economic consequence, because again, as we pointed out, approximately 25% of the seaborne oil trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz, and it is well within the power, everybody admits, of Iran to block that Strait of Hormuz. And again, if this turns into a serious war, which would be really existential for Iran, it is. I think, I don't know if it's likely, but it's very, very possible that is a move that Iran will take. And that will that will have huge consequences for our country and for the entire world economy. And just the fact, actually, even before, even if that doesn't happen, just the fact that a war is taking place there is going to impact the oil trade. So there will be consequences at the fuel pumps, and people will notice that. That's one thing. But another thing too is just to the prestige of the United States. Again, Trump is putting the prestige of the U.S. online here. And if a ship is sunk or a military base is just wiped out, that's going to be something that people will notice, and it will be a shock. I don't know how they're going to respond. They may respond with a burst of patriotism, which could lead us to more problems. But that will have an impact too. Again, we've talked about how fragile support really is, how fragile our system has become because of the very, very minimal legitimacy of all the institutions that really uphold the system. And these kind of shocks, economic shock, and then a shock to, something that's very much a part of our identity now is the invincibility of the U.S. If that is punctured, again, I don't know what the consequences will be, but there will be consequences in this country.
I think it'd be good if we can get, I know we can't say anything with certainty, but I think the problem is most people they can't really imagine anything really bad when we see economic consequences. When we're talking about hyperinflation, like people won't be able to afford groceries. Will we see societal collapse? Will we see fracture? I think people want something more concrete, because it's hard to, and I know that you can't really give anything with certainty, but right. How do we, as normal citizens, prepare for this?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. That's not the kind of channel that we have. I don't know how we prepare for it. Maybe that's go to a survivalist channel or something else. I don't know. But yeah, another aspect of it is, you mentioned the dollar and hyperinflation. Again, it's just like another war for the U.S. is not going to help. Is not going to buttress faith in the U.S. dollar. It's going to be quite the reverse. It's going to add to the worries that investors have around the world already, that the U.S. is no longer a safe haven. It's not entirely sane. It's embarked on another reckless adventure. And If it survives this one, it may not survive the next. That's the thing. That has an effect that will have, maybe, again, we won't see it immediately, but the consequences are real. Again, we've been insulated from reality. I mentioned the example of the Iraq War. It was a hugely expensive war, but by and large, the U.S., voter was never given a bill for it. He was not given a bill for it, right? Because there was this abiding faith in the U.S. system. And when we spent these tremendous amounts of money, wasted tremendous amounts of money on this war, the rest of the world supplied its dollars, to make up for it, to fill the gap. And we just never noticed that anything happened on an economic level. That's changing, that's changing in large part because of our behavior. And it's, we are again we're on thin ice in a way that we were not before. It's very hard to predict when that ice will break, but it will. And, each time that we engage in something like this, we bring that day a little bit nearer.
Right. And Trump and his administration understand that this is changing. But it seems like their strategy is we have to make them bend the knee. We have to force people back into our system. We can't have these dissidents. Can't have countries like Russia and China doing their own thing. And you mentioned in our last conversation as well that this, could potentially eventually lead to a civilizational clash in World War III, something like this. Can you expand on the concept of a civilizational clash? Like, is that different than just like what we're seeing here? Is more than just kind of a potential rivalry that expands, but this is something larger? Is that what we're looking at?
I wouldn't quite call it a civilizational clash. Because what we're seeing, it's okay, we have the kind of two opposing orders now, and one is Western-led hegemony, which you could also call, was going under the name, not used so often anymore, of the international rules-based order. On the other hand, you have multipolarity. That's the rising system. The system that is, is emerging. It's not just something off in the distant future. But this is where the clash is, right? So it's not really one civilization pitted against another. There's this one hegemony. This let's say this end of history. Or call it just a global hegemony that sees itself as the culmination of all historical trends, and understands itself that way. And, there's maybe a little bit of shift, in perception, but let's get back to that later. Okay, there is this one, global hegemony, and then there are these other civilizations. I think it's fair to say that there's a Russian civilization, Indian civilization, so on and so forth, right? But it's not. But they are, all of them are in support, not of, they don't want a new Cold War, a new bifurcated world. They do want a multipolar world, in which ideally, America would accept its role as just one of the poles. The problem is America and its Western, vassals is not complying. It refuses, to accept this new order. And so we have a clash. The clash that exists is, again, between this global hegemony and multipolarity.
I think it's sometimes difficult for the average person to understand it in those terms. But as this clash continues, do you think that it will become clear to people that we have to take a side, that there is a clash, and the clash is between a multipolar vision and the U.S.-led order?
Well, I think that's, especially on the multipolar side, there is a real reluctance to do that. They do not want actually to be drawn into bloc politics. As I said, they don't want a new Cold War, a new bifurcated world. They do want multipolarity. But the problem is that the Western hegemon is not letting them do that. And I think we see that actually happening in Iran. The first round last year, the 12-day war, it appears that the involvement of the Russians and Chinese is very, very minimal. This time it looks like it's actually quite extensive. And, we can get into that because I think they just understand it's like, united we stand, divided we fall. I mean, we can't just let the U.S. start picking off one country after another. They took Venezuela, now they're going to try to take Iran. They've taken Syria. It's like, what are we going to do? We have to draw together. So there is this increasing tightening of alliance, between these countries that, again, it's not what they want. I think there was a real, part of all of them, Iran, China, Russia, certainly India, and I think maybe India is still in that camp. There was a real desire to avoid bloc politics and to, try to make it clear to the West that, okay, yeah, we're not part of of an alliance against you. We are just individual countries, and you want you to treat us this way. But the problem is that, again, the Western hegemon won't do it. It won't accept this multipolar world and is, behaving with increased aggression. And as a consequence, the multipolar allergy to bloc politics, I think, is being overcome. And they're just realizing that, my goodness, this is what we have to do. We really have to draw really much closer together. So here, we got to Iran, take this, we'll help you with that. If they do this, we're going to supply you with that. That's what's happening. And I think the signals actually are quite clear that that's what's happening.
Yeah, I think these countries that are the object of America's aggression, they understand very clearly what's happening, and it's easy to pick a side, and they know what's happening. But for us that are living in the West, that are living in the United States, do you think that we will end up having to pick a side? Like, we will understand what's happening here, that the majority of people, or will most Americans just be lost in some confusion and just, maybe they'll just hop onto the Epstein stuff or Israel, and that sort of puts them in one camp, but they don't really understand what's happening?
Right. I think it's the latter, unfortunately. I think that, the understanding is just very minimal. I guess it's actually better in the U.S., from what I hear, than it is in a lot of European countries. We do have a freer media in general. There are more dissidents. That's what Europeans will tell you. But still, we're very much a minority, and the great majority of people really don't have an understanding of what's going on. Maybe the one exception, which may prove decisive, is Israel, because Israel has become so much a part again of our domestic politics that people are really looking at that. And of course, that is, our relationship with Israel and Zionism. That's not exactly hegemony, but it's very much tied in with it. And if that's where there's going to be some kind of awakening and a real change of direction, change of geopolitical direction, I think it would probably occur in connection with Israel, or potentially. Yeah, if we're looking at some sort of right.
Yeah, I think it's clear. I can just see it online that this is where the battle line is being drawn here in the United States. At least it's concerning Israel. People don't really frame it in the viewpoint of multipolar versus U.S. hegemony. It's like, okay, we have a problem that Israel has way too much power over our country and is pushing us into this war. And there's just Netanyahu talking about fighting an 8-front war. And what he's talking about is us. Mm-hmm. We are that front. And so to just him using that language, I think also helps kind of mobilize the American masses, saying like, okay, wait, we are in a battle. It's a different type of battle. It's an information battle that we're involved in now. And so we'll see. But I think they're going to... I don't see how Israel can win this battle. We'll see what happens. But yeah. Okay, well, maybe let's move over to some news, Dad.
Okay.
Can maybe give me the biggest scoops so far?
Okay, well, just briefly on Iran. I think last time we talked about the George H.W. Bush carrier task force that was going to, was on the east coast of the U.S. and had received an order to prepare for deployment. It's still there. That order for deployment was not issued to my knowledge, but instead we have the Gerald R. Ford carrier, which is supposed to be the largest of them all, that had been in the Caribbean, is now steaming towards the Arabian Sea, and is going to join the assembled fleet there. So there's a question of why that happened. I know that Daniel Davis reported, he said that, he has sources within the military. He said that for a classified reason, the George H.W. Bush task force could not leave, could not depart. And that just may mean that it was, there may be mechanical difficulties. A lot of these aircraft carriers are aging and are not in the best of condition. And interestingly, it was the top brass of the Navy just a few days ago said that if the president ordered the Gerald R. Ford carrier to the Middle East, that he would push back. It's just simply, he says, we're just not ready for it. He said, this is, he felt that the carrier had already been pushed beyond its limits, the personnel and the equipment. But nevertheless, he may have pushed back. I don't know, but it's going, and apparently it's on its way to the Middle East.
Do you think that there's a chance that we'll have more officers begin to disobey orders if it becomes very clear that this war is not, to them, that the people on these ships, that this war is not in America's interest, that we are doing this for Israel, and that we are not equipped for this, that we can't win this war?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that. I don't know people in the military. So far, there's been, very little in the way of disobedience. I guess there was one general that at least spoke out against the operation against Venezuela, and I think he suffered the consequences. I think he was fired or demoted or something. But that's about it. Probably we're not going to see anything like that, unless this turns into a real war and it starts to go badly, and then maybe we'll start to see those kind of, we'll start reading about those kind of people that have decided to refuse orders, but we're not there yet.
You mentioned that China and Russia appear to be helping Iran extensively this time around. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, first of all, I think we got a hint of that, or more than a hint, back in January when the insurrection was suppressed. The Starlink terminals were suppressed, and it was almost certainly Russia that did that. That was an ability that Iran did not have a year ago or did not have last June. So it just shows that they had already gained some technical capabilities that they didn't have earlier. Again, I don't know exactly what the Russians are supplying the Ukrainians, or not the Ukrainians, sorry, the Iranians right now. There have been several news stories about Chinese help. One thing is now I think this is very, very important, actually. The Iranians now have the Beidou system to rely on for communications, including military communications. The Beidou is kind of the equivalent of our GPS system. I think it goes beyond that, but that would be part of it. And that's quite significant. That's something that we can, we can't turn it off. We can't monitor it. It's within Chinese control. And so it provides a very, very secure links for the Iranians. Also, according to Alistair Crook, anyway, that the Chinese have provided them with that integrated, let's say, land-air system that the Pakistanis used to such great effect against the Indians. There was a story about the J-10Cs that actually shot down the Rafale fighters, and what it is, it's a system of, there's a land-based radar, there's the aircraft, the missiles, all of them are integrated. So like when the missile is fired, it's actually guided from the land, and I know there's more to it than that, but it's just this, this larger system that makes, kind of multiplies the power of the fighter or of the missile, whatever it is that is being used. So I I've heard that they have that. I don't know if it's operable yet. I don't know how extensive it is. A lot of this, the Chinese are not going to be telling us about it. This is something that we just don't know. But we do know that they do, because this has been reported, of course, in Western media. They do have a very advanced intelligence gathering ship, on surveillance ship, very close to the American fleet. And that can, again, be extremely helpful for the Iranians, because I'm sure they'll be able to communicate with the Iranians when they see the moment the F-35s or whatever take off, the Iranians are going to know about it. They're not going to be taken by surprise. And then the Chinese and probably the Russians as well are providing them with intelligence. And again, we know that because some of it has been made public. The Chinese have actually been publishing photos of American bases, highly detailed, high-resolution photos, taken by their satellites. And so, of course, the Iranians could read that just like anybody else and say, oh, okay, this building's here, that building's there. But almost certainly they're providing them probably with even higher resolution photos, covertly. So even if there hasn't been, they may not have had time, for example, to assemble a real air defense. Just having these, these intelligence and surveillance capabilities is hugely helpful. Just as it's hugely helpful to the Ukrainians. That's probably, one of the reasons, if not the main reason, that Ukraine is still in the war, is that they do have this support from American satellites and American intelligence in general. But it looks like Iran is getting that, and that's going to make a difference. There's no question about it. That's going to make a difference.
Do you think there's some intense diplomacy going on between U.S. and China right now? I mean, the U.S. has to be aware of, the Pentagon has to understand that China is providing military technology to Iran, and that this could be a problem.
Yeah.
But I mean, what can they say? Nothing, right? I mean,
yeah, right. I don't know that we do diplomacy anymore. Maybe we're threatening them and they're ignoring us. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I really don't.
Do you think that there's a chance that China could get more directly involved in this conflict if it pops off? Because I just feel like the United States, if it suffers a huge defeat, they'll want to. We always blame some other country, like, oh, we would have won if it wasn't for China doing that. We say the same thing with the Ukraine war all the time. Right. Oh, if it wasn't for the Chinese or the North Koreans propping up Russia, we would have won right. 3 years ago. And so if it's a direct thing like this, like, oh, well, the only reason our ship got sunk was because the Chinese were able to provide the positioning data with their satellites. This is the Chinese fault. It's really the Chinese that sunk our ship. I could see that happening. Yeah. And then do they justify blowing up their surveillance ship? Like, would the U.S. do something that crazy?
Well, they just might, of course, it happened during the Serbian War in the end of the 1990s that we bombed the Chinese embassy. I remember at the time, I didn't believe. I assumed it had to be a mistake. I was too much a believer in the American system. But the more I read about it, the clearer it becomes that was intentional. We actually bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade.
Why? What's the purpose?
Well, I think because it may have actually been for the same reason. That's a good point, that they had communications equipment that it was useful to the Serbians. I think that actually might have been it. That's one of the. So there's a risk. This is a large ship, a very expensive ship. It would be, I wouldn't put it past us, but, China is different now. China was much weaker back then at the end of the 1990s. It was still the unipolar moment. China and every other country just tread very carefully around the U.S. But China has shown that it's, has a sense of its own power now, especially when it comes to these economic conflicts. But I don't see why, I think that the response would be very firm from the Chinese. I think it's a new China, it's a new age, and they also understand, they can see what's happening, that, this policy of appeasement that really, that all these countries have pursued, vis-a-vis the U.S., is not working. The U.S. always responds by, just assuming you're weak, you're not going to fight back, and then launching the next war. And so I think they're going to hold their ground. I don't know how they would respond if that happened, but it's something that they must be considering. They must know that that's possible.
That's terrifying to think that if, dragging China into this war, potentially Russia, via Ukraine and this conflict in Iran, and it's just all for nothing. It's all, there's no reason for this. There's no reason for any of this. It's just crazy.
Yeah, that's the thing that, again, there should be alarm bells going off. This is just real madness. No, I remember, the build up to the Iraq war under George W. Bush. There was a real shock and then followed by hysteria, in the wake of 9/11. On one level, that was understandable. It was a shocking event, and so people were frightened. And if you had a president telling you, "Well, I have a solution for you," we have to take out these weapons of mass destruction. This has to be done. There was a very sustained and intensive effort to persuade the American people again that the war was necessary, and then it was carried out with actually tremendous support across the spectrum. The New York Times, all the major media outlets were behind it, and the polls showed that the great majority of people were. This time, it's like, why are you there? It's just, just really, I think probably most people have seen this clip. It's where Trump was actually asked by a journalist, but I thought you obliterated, these sites. So why are you going to bomb them again? He says, basically, well, we'll bomb the dust that's still down there. What is that supposed to mean? This is... And so sometimes it's about the sites, sometimes it's about the missiles, sometimes it's about the dust down there. What's going on? And it's just, there was no buildup, nothing's consistent. It really seems like something that was decided on the spur of the moment, and I suspect that it was, that it was. The whole operation was launched under a mistaken assumption, and that's probably that insurrection was going to succeed. And now we're here, again, for what?
I don't know. But with this other aircraft carrier on the way, I think most people expect that once it arrives, that we'll start seeing strikes relatively shortly after. Is that how you're feeling?
I think there's a very good chance of it. That's all I can say. It's, there's nothing that's certain, especially when it comes to Trump, but there's a very good chance. I've heard everything from 2 weeks to a month, maybe for it to get in position and for all, the various, I don't know what it really takes. I'm not a military man here, but I've heard 2 weeks to a month. And I think Trump actually even offered a month, like I'll give him about a month if I remember correctly. So that could be what we're looking at. That may be the deadline.
Yeah, I feel like with this Epstein stuff is going to push him over the edge to make this happen. This is something that he can't shake, and it's just been devastating to his administration. And he's being known as the Epstein administration, this cover-up administration, the pedophile administration. It's not a good look. So what can he do? And it's just so clear within these Epstein files. It's amazing how mainstream media try to say that this is somehow, he fled to Israel after his crimes, and he's wearing an IDF shirt, and he's meeting with Ehud Barak, and he's met with, he's calling everybody going
like hundreds of times or something.
Yeah, 100 times, right? But clearly that means he's a Russian asset. Somehow that's what they landed on. But it's just so clear that Epstein was heavily involved with Israel. His loyalty was lying with Israel above any other country. And it just seems very clear about that, and all the horrible stuff he's done and all the dirt he has on everybody. And if the rest of these files come out, I think it's over for Israel. It's just going to be undeniable for everybody in the world, like, what has happened here? What is going on? Something very dark and sinister. This country that we were told to basically worship, and many Americans did for so long, is actually this horrible, evil entity that has corrupted much of the United States and taken over so many of our institutions to use for their own gain, and possibly have this very incriminating, criminal pedophile tapes on our politicians that might just push us into this war. I think that's where we're at. It's just so insane. It's so insane.
Yeah, well, it may be. I know that it was a former head of Israeli military intelligence. It's not Mossad, a different intelligence agency, but said that he believed that the Israelis had leverage on Trump because of Epstein. They had compromising material. And he said that openly in an interview. So, again, it may not be true, but there's certainly reason to suspect that it is true. But
Right,
even all that even set that aside, it's just like it's clear that there's a lot of levers that they can apply, and he's under a lot of pressure. I keep on seeing these different clips of let's say former administration officials, and pundits and so on, pretty much mocking him, or implying that if he doesn't go ahead, that he's a weakling. And I think those things, all those, these appear on Fox News, which we know that he watches regularly and seems to regard as more important than his intelligence briefings. And I'm sure that those various statements are having an effect on him.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the Epstein stuff is also just an albatross around his neck, and Israel. So I feel like they just got us the only way out in their mind might be to have this war, and I think that might be one of the big reasons. And it's just so crazy to think that might be the case.
Yeah, I like on Israel's. Okay, well, of course Netanyahu has his own domestic difficulties, but I think Israel might also be just looking at it more strategically. They know that it could be bad now, that they, if a war is launched now, that they're going to probably going to be hit pretty hard. But they still feel like they have a reasonable chance of coming out on top. At least that may be their assessment. It may be a wrong assessment, but I think maybe that's their assessment. They're, again, overconfident. Just to say we're actually overconfident vis-a-vis Hamas. There was this assumption, partly one of the reasons, and I think it may be true, that their guard was down, is that just they really underestimated Hamas, and it just didn't seem to think that they were capable of launching a complicated operation. There obviously was intelligence that some operation was coming, but they just weren't worried about it. But I think they also underestimate the Iranians, and they think that they can win. But they're looking at it, but they may say, well, it could be bad now, but in a year's time, it'll be too late. It'll be impossible. Not only will by that time the Iranians have formidable air defense, but also their missiles will be that much better. I was actually just last night watching an interview of Ted Postal, the military expert, especially missile and rocket expert. And he's saying, the long-range missiles that Iran has now, they're good, but they're not that accurate. They're about accurate within a kilometer. But it won't take that much effort to double their accuracy to, let's say, 500 meters. And when you do that, it becomes possible. And that, with help from the Russians, and he believes that they're receiving that help from the Russians, it may take some time, maybe a year, maybe a couple of years, who knows. But when they achieve those higher accuracies, they can actually just wipe out Tel Aviv with the missiles that they have. They can just wipe out Tel Aviv.
Aren't they pretty accurate already? Because we saw missiles in Tel Aviv, landing in Tel Aviv, and they weren't hitting residential buildings. They were hitting what seemed to be actual,
Yeah, some of them did hit residential buildings. I remember at the end there was, with that, all I can do is go by his analysis, and he does show, a very careful analysis of various Iranian missile strikes. And that's what he says. That's all I can say is that pass that on. Again, I have an impression of greater accuracy like you do, but it's just an impression. And again, he's looked at everything. He says that, they did formidable damage. And one thing is, like, he has relatives and friends in Tel Aviv, and they said, like downtown Tel Aviv was a mess. But you wouldn't know that. Like, again, I read Haaretz, but you almost wouldn't know that it happened. There was a real effort within Israeli media not to talk about it. And by and large, Western media went along with that. So most people don't really understand how much damage was done, but they could do much, much more. That's the point. It's just like just by doubling the accuracy, again, with the missiles they have, they could actually just wipe out. A certain number of missiles actually went into the Mediterranean. We didn't see those. that wouldn't be happening anymore. They would all be, hitting targets, or they're close enough that they would always damage the targets, because these are large enough warheads that if it does land within 500 meters, it's actually going to damage the target. And it gets closer, and it most likely will be closer. When you're taking like 500, that's the outer range. It's going to destroy or severely damage the target. And then when you have, if you send 500 missiles to Tel Aviv altogether, they just pretty much would wipe out Tel Aviv. That's something that, again, it's a conventional capability. We're not talking about a nuclear weapon, but it's almost the effect of a nuclear weapon. So what I'm saying again is that the Israelis understand within a certain period of time, like a year or 2 years or whatever, it's just going to be all over. So they say, well, okay, maybe we could be damaged now, but the Iranians, because we see they're getting this help from the Chinese and the Russians, that's already a problem, but it can become an insurmountable problem, within a year or longer.
Is there any way that Iran or just the world in general can protect itself from the threat of the use of a nuclear weapon by Israel? Like, can we do we know where they're located? Can we bomb the silos so they can't launch out or something? This is what's the most terrifying thing.
Right.
For
No,
me.
it is terrifying. That's something that the Iranians must be considering. They must be wondering, okay, we want to hurt them, but we don't want to hurt them that bad, because it's this is where we are. Again, it's like where you asked at the beginning, are we catastrophizing? I say, no, these are real. This is all very realistic. We know about the Samson option. We know, what could happen here. And probably it won't get to that. But just the fact that it's possible, should be, again, there's something that has happened to the West over the last, maybe it's just since the unipolar moment, that we've just been, this is insufferable smugness or complacency or something that didn't exist before. When I was young, people were really worried about nuclear war. They really were. It was something that was constantly debated, and people say, well, okay, yeah, we don't like the Soviet Union, but we can't have a nuclear war. We have to make peace with them. We need to negotiate. And we did it. It happened under, both Republican and Democratic administrations. But we live in a different time. Again, we just seem to be sleepwalking into disaster. There should be a lot of talk about this, the huge dangers, but instead we're, okay, talking about Pam Bondi. Okay, that's news, but I think this is the bigger news, to be honest.
Yeah, it's all kind of tied in. So I don't care how people get to it. Like you said, like if it's via Epstein or via the conflict here in the Middle East with Gaza and Palestine, in Israel or Iran. But yeah, I'm just wondering, like, what if the Iran struck Dimona, the nuclear facility in Israel? Do you think? First of all, the United States, we struck Iran's heavily surveilled, IAEA inspected nuclear facilities. These had like cameras in basically every single room. We knew what was going on there. There was nothing nefarious, but we do have this secret weapons nuclear plant in Israel, Dimona, that they apparently use to make their nuclear weapons when they're not part of the NPT, not inspected. What if Iran struck that plant? What would
I guess
could the U.S. Go ahead.
I guess there's certainly it seems to me that there's a danger that one or more nuclear weapons could be detonated as a result, and then the blame would probably be placed on Iran. Unfortunately,
if they're storing them there, I don't know if they store them at that plant.
I don't know. Actually, you're right. I don't know. So I just don't know what. Where
well, they're not supposed to have nuclear weapons. How could you blame Iran? It's like you want what? Where did that come from?
They will. They'll have a way of blaming Iran. That they will.
Yeah, but would you think the world would accept that? It's
a part of the world might.
I don't know. I just don't understand. I just don't say it's like, hey, yeah, you were never supposed to have allowed to have nuclear weapons to begin with.
Right.
It is one of the craziest things. Do most people around the world, they understand that Israel has nuclear weapons and they're not supposed to?
It's kind of it's one of the worst kept secrets. It's actually the Israelis want people to know that they have nuclear weapons without ever officially acknowledging them. That's been their policy for a long time. So yeah, every government in the world, and I think most people around the world know that they do have nuclear weapons.
Did you hear about there's some clips, I think it was on Judge Knapp, and I've seen it some other places where they say that the Saudis have nuclear weapons. Do you believe that?
I don't think so. I think I've heard that rumor, but I don't think so. It's always possible. There's, it's what can you say? They have a relationship with the Pakistanis who have them, and maybe I think that's the story is that they worked out a deal with the Pakistanis, and the Pakistanis transferred some nuclear weapons to them. Now, I just heard that, that rumor from one source, and it hasn't been confirmed. So I think it's unlikely, but it's not impossible. Of course, it's not impossible.
Yeah, this war is going to go nuclear. I feel like that's the inevitable outcome of this conflict.
Yeah, I'll never say inevitable. I mean, there's even a chance
very
we
likely
might not have the war. I hope so. Yeah. Garland Nixon believes that we won't, and I hope he's right.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I hope he's right too. I mean, you never know with Trump. He always has that ability to just turn on a dime. So, but I just feel like they got him cornered with Epstein and everything else.
It's just hard to see how he could do it, in this case. And I don't see how he's going to do it. But he might. He can surprise us. He's surprised. I think this would be the biggest taco, it would be the best one. I would say
the biggest and best.
Yeah, it would definitely be a thumbs up from me, but not likely.
Okay, well then let's move over to Ukraine. It feels I haven't been paying as close attention, but it feels like the Trump administration has kind of just put things on autopilot with Ukraine. Is that accurate? Or are they actually kind of getting more involved in the Ukraine war? Or what's...
Okay, well, a lot of, again, we mentioned the intelligence support, the targeting support, all that has never slowed down. I think that needs to be understood, and that is a very important part of the war. One thing is like the CIA has shown no willingness to slow down. So even if Trump absolutely ordered them not to, I think there would be an open question as to whether they would obey his order. But he hasn't ordered them not to. So, Ukraine continues to receive that support, which is extremely important. Also, this was kind of a surprise to me, but according to Jennifer Kavanaugh, in a very carefully researched paper that she published on strategic statecraft, there's still billions of dollars in the pipeline from the Biden administration that the U.S. has committed to. It's money that's already been allocated, and as new Patriot interceptors and other weapons and various weapon systems and military equipment come off the production lines in the U.S. MIC, a considerable share of all that goes to Ukraine, and that flow has continued. It really hasn't slowed down. Now we have Pearl. That's that mechanism whereby the Europeans purchase American equipment and give it to Ukraine, and that there have been some billions of dollars that have gone through that already. I think all in all, like support for Ukraine clearly has gone down. It has become, the flow is diminished. Now, it's not clear to me. Let's say if we still had, well, we wouldn't have Biden, but if we had Harris in charge, and we would get exactly the same policies, I'm sure. It's not clear to me that we really would see a difference. Maybe, we'll have much more rhetorical support. And as long as it takes, we'd be hearing all the same things. There'd probably be no negotiations. But would we be giving them more systems? We would be making it easier for the Europeans. I think this Pearl system, it does provide a mechanism whereby, again, the Europeans can support Ukraine with American weapons. But those American weapons are limited. The stockpiles have been depleted. Our annual production of these different systems, and we've gone through this many times, is very limited. Would it really be different, under Biden? Maybe we're getting a little less now than we would otherwise, but I don't think it's going to be it's a considerable difference because there are these hard constraints that are in place. So I don't know that, again, rhetorically, things have really changed. And we do have these negotiations, but these negotiations are going nowhere. And we have continued to have the dirty war. It wasn't too long ago, again, that a general was assassinated, or there was the attempted assassination of Alexeyev, right? The head of the GR, or the senior deputy to the head of the GRU. Now, we don't, people will always say, well, the CIA must have been involved with that. I don't know. Yeah. But it's hard to believe the CIA didn't at least know something about it because they're so closely tied to the GRU in particular. And then earlier we had the drone attack on Putin's Valdai residence. A lot of people say that that was an assassination attempt. I'm not going that far because the Russian government hasn't said that. I went back and looked at all the official reports, and they always say an attack on his residence. If he was there and it seemed to be going after him, I'm sure they would say that. I think so, unless they are deliberately trying to downplay it. But the fact is that that's not what they're saying, attack on his residence. But still, that's major. Just like we say, okay, Trump's in the White House, but the Russians sent drones to Mar-a-Lago. Or 94 drones and try to to take it out or something. That would be huge. Of course, that would be huge. We would be up in arms. We would be talking about using nuclear weapons against Russia, something like that. The Russians are, again, so quiet. So again, we are seeing a continuation of the dirty war, and the attacks on their energy infrastructure, all the intelligence support, and then the arms in general are flowing. We haven't seen an escalation. There was talk about the Tomahawks. And it looks like maybe we did use a couple of ATACMS, but then we stopped. But again, it may be due to hard constraints. We don't even make ATACMS anymore, to my knowledge. And we just don't have that many of them. We already gave something like 500 to Ukraine. Now we're giving a large quantity to Taiwan. It just may be that, okay, we want to actually fire them into pre-2014 Russia, but we can't. And in fact, that was done, of course, under Biden. With very little effect. So, by and large, you just look at all this and you just say things really haven't changed. Sometimes you can get, myself included, just because the rhetoric is so different and there's so much anger, among the Europeans and various Ukraine supporters against Trump. And they feel like he's sabotaging it, whatever. It's because of Trump that, we're suffering these failures. But if you really look at the hard numbers, to the extent that we really have the hard numbers, things don't look that different. They look very, again, maybe there's been a slight diminution in actual, military support, but only a slight one. I think that has to be said.
Is there any type of plan forming with the West, the Europeans, and the United States in this war with Russia? Or is it just sort of stay the course and just keep fighting Ukrainians until what? Is there a plan forming?
Yeah, well, what you're always told, again and again, and we've been hearing this for 4 years now, is that we need to support the Ukrainians so they have a better, a stronger position at the negotiating table. So we have to give them this weapon system or that weapon system, and then they can hurt the Russians, and then the Russians will agree. Now, obviously, it hasn't worked because their negotiating position has, ever since the fall of 2022, has only gotten worse. It's been steadily worse year after year after year, and their position deteriorated really dramatically, you have to say, over the course of last year and into the beginning of this year, because not only did they lose some major towns on the front line, but also and suffer all the casualties. But their whole electrical grid has really just been snuffed out. I mean, that's so, what is this argument? You just keep telling, just trust us. We're going to give you this. That's this next weapon system or this next $90 billion. That'll turn things around. And then the Russians, you'll have a stronger negotiating position. There's no reason to believe that the trend won't continue, that their position will get weaker and weaker and weaker month after month. But the appearance, it's just like they're the Europeans and again, many American supporters of Ukraine are just completely blind to this. It's clear they didn't have really a plan B. Russia was supposed to collapse or not. Well, we'll just have to wait for Russia to collapse at some point. We'll just keep on going because we don't have another plan.
Let's just say that there is a negotiated settlement reached, that Russia gets the four oblasts and then it just stops. And what happens to the remainder of Ukraine? Who's responsible for getting the lights back on, rebuilding after all the destruction? Like, how can they even do that? And
Yeah.
are the Europeans expected to finance it? And
I think so. I mean, it's going to be the Europeans. The Americans, at least under Trump, show absolutely no interest in doing that. That's something that's different, right? I think that's where you could see a difference between a Harris administration and a Trump administration. Okay, in general, the military support, the intelligence support, all that, the dirty war, that's probably would have been pretty much the same under both of them. But there is, an unwillingness on the part of Trump to actually directly fund Ukraine. And so I think the Europeans would be stuck with the bill. I think that's basically what it would come down to.
could they? Could they just say no and then just what happens? Because this is the burden is massive. This is the problem. I think that the Europeans find themselves in. It's like, well, the idea was that we have to win the war because then we can make Russia pay for it. But if we don't win the war, then we're on the hook for everything. So this is a huge problem. We've already sunk all this money in. And then if it stops where it is now, then we can't get Russia to pay for the destruction on the side, the western side of Ukraine. We're going to be stuck with it. So maybe it's even better if we just tell them to keep on fighting and then there's nobody left and then Russia takes all the territory and then they have to rebuild it. It's almost like maybe that's what they're thinking. Maybe they're just these, soulless ghouls that don't care how many people die and they're just thinking about the money and their power and that's it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, no, that's, I think that was actually written into that resolution to create the $90 billion loan, the 93 billion euro loan to Ukraine, the one that passed following the failed effort to actually use the Russian assets as collateral. But for this case, the collateral is supposed to be Russian reparations, which is just this, it's obviously just fantastical. That's right. They're just living in a fantasy land. I don't know if maybe some of them actually believe in it. I think probably, maybe Kaya Kallas actually does. She might be that stupid. The others, yeah, they are obsessed with their own images, and it's also sort of an emotional thing. They emotionally invested in this and they don't want to actually stop it, pull back and make think rigorously about what's good for Ukraine. Obviously, they're not doing that, in the end, it really doesn't make any sense, but it just seems like we're just talking about people that are not, I don't think are fit to govern. Maybe it was just, again, Europe was, and the West were so prosperous and so safe for so long that all of our, that within our political class, let's say the to use a metaphor, it's like, if you have the muscles that they had that you would have used in the past to government, they've all atrophied, just like their ability to actually govern and to make hard decisions is atrophied. They're just used to virtue signaling and, and giving pretty speeches, and they don't seem to be able to get out of that. I just don't see any sign of it.
Okay. So, but wasn't Ukraine supposed to be hitting a fiscal cliff soon? Like monetarily, that they wouldn't be able to keep the government running. Do you know anything about that?
There are different estimates, but I think there's a good chance they'll hit that fiscal cliff sometime this year. Again, the estimates that were made and formed the basis of that 93 billion euro loan, which it's not even clear if it's actually going to happen. It's supposed to be, I think it was approved, but it hasn't actually been put together. It's not clear how they're going to do that. But let's say they actually supply that money. That figure was based on certain estimates, but I think that was prior to the immense damage that the Russian missile and drone strikes have done to the Ukrainian economy. It's just, again, it's not only that it's causing suffering among civilians and it's creating logistical difficulties and it's hampering military production there in Ukraine. But it's also just, again, companies can't do business when they don't have electricity. Or if they only have electricity 4 hours a day, they do very little business. So it just has to be putting a huge dent in this already very damaged economy. And so that if that's assuming that 93 billion figure was realistic, and a lot of people argue that it wasn't. But let's just assume that it was, for argument's sake. It's not going to be realistic any longer because their needs are going to be that much greater this year. So I think, yeah, they are looking at a fiscal cliff sometime this year.
We're just doomed, Dad. I started this off saying we're too much doom and gloom, and I'm full doom and gloom right now. It's just for Europe, the Ukraine war is going to crush them. For the United States, the Ukraine war, but more so the Iran war that's coming, is going to crush us. Like both of these things are just going to end. Any idea of Western dominance, just our Western systems. I think I think this is going to upend everything. NATO, the European Union, the United States just as a country, I just don't think can survive this whole, and we're barreling right down through it. And there doesn't seem to be, like they always say, there's no reverse gear. I don't see us turning around. Just this Ukraine war is insane. It's absolutely lost, but there's no plan. The plan is just keep going. And eventually Russia will just have a giant heart attack and then fall down is what they're hoping. It's insane. Yeah. So I just, and then with Iran, it's like we feel like Trump has just been maneuvered into a checkmate position is what we're saying. That it seems to be very hard for him to talk out of this one. And once it does, we talked about the power of Iran with the backing of Russia and China, and the possibility that we might, have a more direct conflict with China due to their involvement into this war. It's just, and then the potential end of Israel as it starts getting pounded, and the use of the Samson option is just like, this is just insanity. Like I feel like we can see the road that we're going down, and it's just fire. It's just chaos and disaster, and we're just marching straight down this path. And I just. Every time we have these conversations, it just feels so obvious to me that this is the path we're heading. And then I'm just wanting to shake people like, hey, wake up. Look where we're going. This is not good. But we can't, there's no way to get sense into our leaders. And it might be because they're just, compromised by this Epstein thing and they need a distraction. This is not something that is just in America. This is the Western world. We've seen people. Yeah. And in the Middle East as well, we saw what that CEO of in Saudi Arabia, so that Sultan, right? He resigned after he was named as the one that sent the torture video to Epstein. It's involving everybody that's in part of this, demonic elite Western club. It's not solely Western because there are other people in there, but it's bad, Dad. It's bad, and there's no way out.
Yeah, well, I'll never say there's no way out. I'm sure that we're headed for a day of reckoning, and the sooner the better. I would say, if we're going to have this war, and it looks like we're going to have it, it would probably be good, for us good for the U.S. to actually get a bloody nose. I mean, I hate to say that because if the U.S. gets a bloody nose, Iran's going to be just greatly battered. A lot of people are going to be killed there. I believe they're going to survive. And in the end, people are going to look and say, well, in essence, they won. They held on and they had the moral position. I think that's what's going to happen. I don't know for sure. But if the U.S. gets a bloody nose, I just hope that's a wake-up call. Again, it's just we've been sleepwalking into these disasters. But I'm not confident that it will be. I just think back to 9/11. We just we took the ball and we ran the wrong way down the field with that. That should have been a wake-up call where say, wait a second, why were we involved in these conflicts in the first place? Mm-hmm. What was the need for it? And I know like Ron Paul made that argument very, very cogently and very bravely. And he was universally condemned. People were outraged that he would say that. And instead, everybody started, rallied around the flag and believed in the WMD nonsense, and we launched this completely unnecessary war. So my fear is that if we get a bloody nose, that instead of actually waking up, we're just going to launch an even more absurd and, in the end, self-destructive adventure than the one that we're poised to undertake right now.
I think you might be right, but I think that the people will be wary this time. You know, we've learned just from the 20 years of the war
I
on
think
terror
that's
that
true.
was an absolute disaster. And like you said, we didn't lay the groundwork for this. It's very clear this is on the backdrop of the whole Epstein files scandal. You know, it's very and just this whole suspicion surrounding Israel and their involvement here. And you know, there's just so much going on. I just don't see there'll be a lot of division for sure in the United States.
Yeah,
But
it
I
is.
think
The country has changed. You're right. I think it's much less gullible than it once was. So yeah, I think you're right. We shouldn't expect the same sort of reaction this time, and we may actually get some real introspection this time around.
But the question is once if all of a sudden if something bad happens and your base gets hit or and a bunch of soldiers die, American soldiers die, you know, maybe we won't come out waving the flag and say like, yeah, let's go get them. What happens if we take out the pitchforks? But the government, the establishment is just like, no, I'm the commander in chief. Trump is just saying we're going, and we just go, and then you just have angry mobs, you know, in cities. Well, can we shut it down? I mean, can we the people? Do we the people have any power? It just feels feel so powerless, you know.
Right. Well, you know, if we don't go to, let's say, hard authoritarianism, the way that Ukraine has, where they are grabbing people off the streets, and as we see every day, and sending them to the front, you know, sending unwilling combatants to the front. If we don't go that route, I think that we do have a say, you know, and that is a problem. I think that the political class, both here and Europe, understands that, again, a long-term war it will require active cooperation of the people, at least under the current political system. If we don't go to the Ukraine model, we do need that. And if they don't get it, they're not going to be able to carry out their war against Russia or their attempt at a ground invasion in Iran or whatever. So it does put a brake. I think that it is something that does constrain the power of the ruling class.
Okay, well, I think we can end it here, Dad. It's going to get interesting.
Okay.
All right. Thanks so much. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.